Okay, we're going to go ahead and get going. I want to try to finish up the text of the Constitution this evening and finish up a little course on it. So let me open us in prayer. Again, our Father, we thank you for your blessings to us. Thank you for allowing us to live in these days and in this country. And we pray that you'll help us to be faithful in all things and be truly faithful citizens so that we can honor you and call others of our co-countrymen to follow the King who is Jesus, our Savior. Help us to follow him and learn of him. And thank you again for giving us opportunity to study tonight. For Jesus' sake, amen. All right, I want to pick up where we left off last week and actually run through the rest of the text. And obviously we're going to be skipping some of the things, but in Article 2, we have the article that concerns the executive branch, the president. And the first paragraph talks about the term of office, and the term of office is 4 years, as you know. There was no limit on the number of consecutive terms that a president could serve when the country started. Washington served one term, was reelected for another term, and then he quit, even though they wanted him to continue on. He stopped, and that set a precedent that every president until President Roosevelt followed only 2 terms. But President Roosevelt was elected for 4 terms. He didn't fill out all 4 terms, but he was elected so that a 22nd Amendment in 1951 was passed that limited the number of consecutive terms that presidents could serve to 2. So that's why we now are at 2 terms. Paragraph 2 talks about the manner of election, and it talks about the right to vote, as well as the Electoral College. And this is a good opportunity to go into some of the things that have been, some of the things that some radical historians have accused the Founding Fathers of. The first one was the fact that the right to vote was not universal. It was given to those who held property. And of course, some Marxist historians have said that this proves that the Founding Fathers were trying to consolidate power into the hands of a few and to establish an aristocracy in America. They forbade the people, you see, from ruling and having a voice in the government. Well, that's simply not true. There are a number of things that need to be noted about this in regard to the right to vote. The first one is that men who did not own property were almost non-existent in this country at the time of the Constitution. There was a study of the state of Massachusetts in the late 18th century and early 19th century that showed that virtually all the men of the state met the property requirement. And the same was true of most states. Gouverneur Morris said that during the debates, he said 9/10 of the citizens of the nations are already freeholders, and he's referring there to owning property. So that's the first thing. Very few people would have been excluded or were excluded by this prerequisite. The other requirement to vote was that, the other thing to mention about this is the property requirement did not apply in national elections. So if you're talking about the election of the president, everybody could vote for that. Only local and state elections actually had property requirements as requirements for voting. The property requirements were generally a little higher on the local level than they were on state elections, by the way. And the third thing to note is that the purpose of restricting suffrage to property holders was primarily moral and spiritual, not economic. They weren't trying to exclude the common man and allow the wealthy just to rule the country. Since land was so cheap and so easily obtainable, as I mentioned, if you didn't have property, it was kind of a sign that you were irresponsible and kind of a lazy good-for-nothing. And so the attitude was, if non-property holders are allowed to vote, then you're allowing the ungodly to exercise rule. And so, as Dr. Rushdoony pointed out, he said that there was a real basis for this. He said the basis for suffrage and representation was responsible character. Hence, no recipient of government subsidies or charity could vote. The original idea of the poll tax was to establish responsibility. The responsible taxpayer was made the voter. And that was kind of the philosophy of the Founding Fathers. Only those who had a stake in society, who actually had invested in the country had a right to exercise rule or to determine what was happening in the country. Few citizens in 1787 would have disagreed with John Jay's statement. John Jay, of course, the first Supreme Court justice and leader, he said, the people who owned the country ought to govern it. And that was the idea behind a property requirement. If you own property, you care about what happens. You care about what goes on. If, on the other hand, you're a recipient of just welfare and charity, then you're going to sell your vote to anybody who will promise you more good things. And so they wanted to restrict that from happening. The fourth thing about the property requirement was to prevent the rise of an aristocracy rather than to establish an aristocracy. And the reason was it was the belief of the Founding Fathers that if non-property owners were allowed to vote, they would actually usher in an aristocracy. Gouverneur Morris, who was very outspoken on this point, he believed that an aristocracy was inevitable if non-property citizens were allowed to vote. He says, and this is from the notes from the Federal Convention. You may know of Max Ferrand's records of the Federal Convention. These are the debates that went on in the Constitutional Convention. And so you have notes that actually you can follow up what was said by various men during the debates. And this is a section out of those debates, or out of the notes of those debates. One of Morris's principal objection to the Constitution, as it is now before us, is that it threatens this country with an aristocracy. He said the aristocracy would grow out of the House of Representatives. Give the votes to people who have no property, and they will sell them to the rich who will be able to buy them. Now, we have seen that very thing happen in our day. And he goes on to say, the man who does not give his vote freely is not represented. It's the man who dictates the vote. Children do not vote. Why? Because they want prudence, because they have no will of their own. The ignorant and the dependent can be as little trusted with public interest. So the concern there, you see, if you allow people who are not property holders, who are dependents in various ways, they will sell their votes to the people who promise them the most goodies, and that's exactly, as I mentioned, that's exactly what we've seen. These men saw universal suffrage, therefore, as a door to an attack on private property and the right to property. If that was lost, they believed that liberty was lost. Thomas Jefferson makes that point. He says the true foundation of Republican government is the equal right of every citizen in his person and in his property. In the American states, everyone by his property or by his satisfactory situation is interested in the support of law and order. Again, if you own the country, if you have a stake in the country, you own property, you want law and order, you want justice, you want wise men ruling. If you don't have that, then you don't have much to lose. You just want the people who will give you favors. So liberty was dependent upon property, not equality. And that's an emphasis that should be put on billboards all around. Liberty is founded upon property. Founders knew that liberty ensured inequality. If you have true liberty, you can't have equality in the sense that everybody has the same things, or what is called now equity, equal outcomes. You cannot have equal outcomes and have true liberty. So Stephen Hopkins said in 1764, they who have no property can have no freedom. That was a fundamental conviction of all the Founding Fathers. But that leads us to talk about the Electoral College real briefly. Again, we've gone over this in detail a little bit previously, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But the Electoral College is a brilliant, brilliant system, even though people mock it and want to destroy it today. We need to maintain the Electoral College. It was a very, very important institution that they came up with, and as I say, a really brilliant solution to protect against corruption as it was originally intended. It was formed for three reasons: to prevent undue influence from Congress so that no senator or representative can be an elector. You can't have that guy voting for the president. It was also, secondly, was formed to hinder corruption, to prevent a small group, a minority of powerful men from manipulating an election. And the third thing was to prevent undue influence from larger states, that all the states would be represented in a fair way. So the Electoral College originally was set up to be the exact numerical equivalent of Congress. So you had one elector from each congressional district in the state, and then 2 at-large electors that would be elected by the entire state. So you see, under this arrangement, when you went to vote, you would vote for 3 men in a presidential election, say. You would vote for your district, your congressional district's elector. That would be one of the votes. And then you would vote for 2 more men who would represent the whole state, like they would be equivalent to the senators of the state. So each elector would cast then, after he was elected by the people, he would then cast his vote. Usually he would cast his vote, the vote of his district. So if his congressional district voted for a certain candidate, that's how he would vote. And then the 2 at-large electors would vote for the person who won the popular vote of the state as a whole. So you see, under this system, it was not at all unusual to have a state cast its electoral votes for 2, 3, or sometimes even 4 or 5 candidates, because whoever won the congressional district would get that electoral vote. Now, this is brilliant. It would be so good because it makes corruption almost impossible. Alexander Hamilton observed that. He said, "This process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will seldom fall to the lot of any man who is not an eminent degree endowed with requisite qualifications." I'm sorry, I put this in here to show how naive Alexander Hamilton was. He says that we'll never have a president who is not highly qualified. Talents for low intrigue and the little arts of popularity may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state, but it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole Union. It will not be too strong to say that there will be a constant probability of seeing the station, he's talking about the presidency, filled by characters preeminent for ability and virtue. Now, what that shows you, though, is how these men could not imagine that we would ever have a president like some of the presidents we've had. They would never have thought that this country would ever have elected such men. And that's one thing. So we can say that's naive, and I will say that, but it shows you that how confident these men were in the integrity of this country. By the 1830s, however, things had begun to change. The Constitution didn't require that electors be elected from each congressional district. That was kind of everybody's assumption is how this would work, but it was not required in the Constitution. And so men began to think, they began to actually realize that there's the power of a general ticket would be much more valuable. A general ticket would mean that whoever won the majority of votes in the state got all the electoral votes. It didn't matter if he may have lost the majority of the congressional districts, but if he won the large cities, that would give him a majority statewide, and he would get all the electoral votes, and the other guy would get nothing. So it was a winner-take-all kind of thing. The general ticket is one of the worst things that's happened in our country. The general ticket transformed national elections. Under the original intended system, of course, every vote counted. You felt like, we can do something, even if I live in a state dominated by the man that I don't want to win. But he's going to win our state, the popular vote. I can still get some electoral votes for my guy if I go out and vote. Every vote counted under the original idea. So, for example, just to show you how this worked, in 1828 in New York State, look at the results of the presidential election. Here, Andrew Jackson defeated John Quincy Adams. The popular vote was very close, 51% to 49%. The Electoral College, however, reflected the vote of the people accurately. Jackson got 20 electoral votes, and John Quincy Adams got 16. Now you see that reflects the actual the actual popularity of each man statewide by districts, by congressional districts, as well as giving them 2 votes for winning. That Jackson got 2 votes for winning the popular vote in the state, and then he won 2 more districts than did John Quincy Adams. By contrast, look at 1832. The general ticket was put into place, I think, in 1830. So the election of 1832, the presidential election, was elected under the general ticket. Look at the results now. Andrew Jackson defeated Henry Clay. He received 52% of the vote this time, of the popular vote. But this time, he received all 42 of New York's electoral votes. Henry Clay received 48% of the vote, got no electoral votes. Now you see, in this situation, almost half of the people, their vote didn't even have any effect at all. Whereas he could have had as many as maybe 14 or 15 electoral votes if they had done this properly. That way you get a truly popularly elected president. You don't allow the big cities to dominate, which is what they do today. By 1836, every state except South Carolina chose their electors by general ticket. This has been a horrible thing. It's caused a great many, it's transformed the country. One of the things that has transformed our country. Look at the results of this. 3 very important consequences of the general ticket. The first is it gave great influence to the large cities at the expense of rural communities. Just look at our state and think about what congressional districts have the most influence under a general ticket. Well, it doesn't take long to figure, we're going to look at New Orleans, you're going to look at Lake Charles, the Lake Charles area, and then you're going to look at Shreveport. And the rest of the districts, if you can get a majority in those areas, you will likely win the entire state and get all of it, even if you only won those 3 districts. So it gave tremendous power to big cities, high population centers, and allowed politicians to ignore less populated areas and people in a different culture you see in the state. It also, secondly, made for the citification of politics. Obviously, the interest of urban areas dominate. Just think about your most recent presidential election. They only visited big cities. They only talk about the problems big cities have. Most of the people in the country don't have to deal with those issues because they're not in the big cities, but big cities dominate national politics. And then thirdly, and this is perhaps the worst thing, it's given tremendous power to minorities. The interest of special interest groups were never big enough, obviously, to swing an election because you had to cover the whole state. You had to win every congressional district. And your interest group or your minority group was not big enough to do that. But when you go to a general ticket, what you end up doing is looking for 6% of the vote. All I need is that as a swing vote. If I can get a minority or a special interest group to vote for my guy, that might be the swing vote that gives him the majority of the popular vote and will get him all the electoral votes. So you focus on the minorities, you focus on special interest, which again, you can ignore the concerns of the majority. It's a very, very radicalizing principle. So with the general ticket, minority groups have become the most important influences in national election, in national politics, and in the culture. They get a lot of coverage. They get a lot of interest in all the rest, when in fact, they are very small percentages of the population, extremely small percentages. So for example, the homosexual lobby, a very, very small percentage of the population as a whole, but who gets coverage? Whose concerns are immediately seen to and heard? It's because they're a swing vote. They're a swing vote in a general ticket. The first group to take advantage of this was the abolitionists, the radical abolitionists of the 1840s. And ever since the 1860s, minorities have been the dominant force in framing national issues and in public policy and in national politics. The problem, you see, with the Electoral College is not its structure. It's a wonderful system. It's the general ticket that destroyed the whole intent almost of the Electoral College. Not quite. It's still important to maintain it, and we need to be ready to defend it the next time, because they're going to keep attacking it every time a candidate, especially if it's the progressive candidate, every time a progressive candidate loses the presidency because of the Electoral College, they're going to demand that be dismantled. So we have to defend it. Okay, well, paragraph 3 talks about the method of electing presidents and vice president. And what was funny about this is the guy who won the Electoral College was president. The guy that came in second became vice president. That had some very interesting results. So your most vicious opponent is your vice president there. Paragraph 4 talks about the time of elections. They're set for the first Tuesday and after the first Monday in November. Paragraph 5, the qualifications for the office. You have to be 35 years old, and you have to be a resident or a citizen for 14 years. The 12th Amendment established the qualifications for vice president later on. Okay, well, we can go down to one thing about paragraph 8. I mentioned this before. The oath of office is a covenant ritual. It's a covenant liturgy. Where you put your hand on the Bible and raise your other hand to heaven. This is an oath-taking, covenant-making ceremony. And I mentioned that the Bible was often open to Deuteronomy 28, so that the president was actually saying, I pledge to do what God has commanded, and also to keep the Constitution, uphold the Constitution. And if I don't, then may God strike me dead, because that's the nature of an oath. And that ceremony is still contained, though now they allow Qurans to be used, or a devotional book that your crazy aunt had and you didn't throw away, or something like that. The next section of Article 2 is the section on the powers of the chief executive. I won't really spend any time on this, but except to notice section 4, which refers to impeachment of civil officers, and the reasons for impeachment are intentionally severe: treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. You can't be impeached for sending out a bunch of bad tweets or something like that. It has to be truly serious crimes committed, and when we begin to trivialize impeachment, as has been done just simply to get back at a political opponent, then you're destroying the significance of a very important disciplinary thing. It's important to be able to have this power. If we get a madman in, we need to be able to take him down, take him out peaceably, and that's what impeachment does. You don't want assassins running around taking out bad guys. So impeachment serves us well there. Article 3 then turns us to the Judicial Branch, which has become one of the most important sections of the Constitution. But unfortunately, as Dr. Forrest McDonald has pointed out, it was this portion of the Constitution that the founders spent the least time on. And he says, Dr. McDonald says, that there were two reasons for them not spending a lot of time on Article 3, which deals with the judicial branch. The first one was the framers were in basic agreement in regard to judicial power. There wasn't a lot of disagreement here. They felt no need really to debate the issues. They assumed a lot of things would be done and forever held true, and they just didn't go over this as carefully or give it as much time as they did other sections. And secondly, the framers believed that the judicial branch of government was the least powerful and would be the least active. And when you hear some of the founding fathers talk about the judicial branch, it's really astonishing. So, for example, look at this from Alexander Hamilton. He says, "Whoever attentively considers the different departments of power must perceive that in a government in which they are separated from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to political rights of the Constitution, because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. This simple view of the matter suggests several important consequences. It proves incontestably that the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power, that it can never attack with success either of the other two, and that all possible care is requisite to enable it to defend itself against their attacks. It equally proves that though individual oppression may now and then proceed from the courts of justice, the general liberty of the people can never be endangered from that quarter. Imagine that he really sincerely believed we don't have to worry about the courts. We don't have to worry about the Supreme Court. They will never do anything that's going to injure the political liberty of the people of this country. And it's become, again, you see, they are assuming a high level of integrity among the men who occupy the seats of the court, the judges, the places of judges in our country. They just could not imagine unprincipled men taking advantage of the Constitution and abusing the Constitution like the courts have done. The courts have been kind of the leading branch of government to cause all kinds of problems for us. Hamilton, this is another part of this quote, Hamilton believed the threat of impeachment would be sufficient if you had an unruly judge or a judge who was just going beyond the constitutional bounds. Look at what he says. There can never be a danger that judges, by a series of deliberate usurpations on the authority of the legislature, would hazard the united resentment of the body entrusted with it, while the body was possessed of the means of punishing their presumption by degrading them from their stations. In other words, they will never risk impeachment. Why would they won't do that? That'll keep them in line. They wouldn't want to be embarrassed by being impeached. Well, of course, they have just stomped all over that. There are a couple of important provisions in this section that need to be noted. The first is that Congress was given the power to establish inferior courts. It was not required. And most of the founding fathers believed that the federal court system was completely unnecessary. They didn't think it would be useful at all. They felt that the state courts would be adequate to deal with things, and the Supreme Court could deal with the things that the Constitution spoke about, so they didn't think this was necessary. When a motion was made to establish or to mandate inferior courts, it was defeated, and defeated soundly, so soundly that Wilson and Madison moved that Congress be granted the right to establish such courts if they saw fit. And that's why this clause is in the Constitution. Everybody goes, well, we can't envision any time where they will see fit, but if such a thing arises, okay, we'll grant them the power to do it. Well, of course, in 1789, the courts were established through the Judiciary Act of 1789. But this clause opens up an interesting possibility constitutionally. Since the Congress can establish lower courts, it also has the authority to abolish lower courts. So the whole federal court system could be abolished if we had a Congress that believed that that would be advantageous, and I'm about to the point thinking that would be advantageous. But that's a possibility constitutionally. Secondly, judges were to hold their offices during good behavior. Basically, that's a lifetime appointment. And the reason they did that, and they also said you can't fiddle with their salaries. Their salaries are set. You can't threaten them by cutting their salary down or cutting it off. And the reason they did that was to try to ensure the independence of the judiciary so that it wouldn't be politicized. You wouldn't be subject to political pressure. Now, of course, our Supreme Court and just about every court in our country is highly political. And so what happens is the Democrats are confident if they can get control of the Supreme Court, well, they can bring the revolution home. They can do whatever they want, and they're right. If they pack the court, that will be basically the end of our republic, because judges now, or at least many judges, the progressive ones, follow a political line. They have an agenda that they are going to promote through their rulings. So we have lost, really, justice because of the departure from the Constitution and, of course, from biblical integrity. Section 2 talks about judicial power, and it lays out the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. And this is another one of those areas where people are not, we don't think about it. I don't think most people have never read the Constitution to see that the Supreme Court has a very strictly limited jurisdiction. It's extremely carefully spelled out in this section. So, for example, it says that it has jurisdictions over cases in law and equity arising under the Constitution. The court has only jurisdiction in cases where Congress or the President overstep their constitutional bounds, or where states engage in activity that's forbidden to them by the Constitution. The jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is restricted to those areas over powers which are granted to the federal government and forbidden to the states. They have no right, no jurisdiction over anything else but that. It also has jurisdiction in cases that involve the nation's representatives or the nation itself. So if somehow we had an ambassador that was charged with a crime, he would be tried before the Supreme Court by a foreign nation if a foreign nation did that. And finally, its jurisdiction is in cases that involve two or more states. In other words, cases where the state Supreme Courts, you wouldn't want them ruling in a case, let's say the Alabama Supreme Court taking the case Alabama versus Mississippi. You don't want the Alabama Supreme Court ruling there, and the Mississippians and the Alabamians wouldn't want the Mississippi Supreme Court ruling there. So that case would go before the Supreme Court. And they spell out there are four such situations: cases which involve a state and a citizen from a different state, cases which involve citizens from two different states, cases which involve citizens of the same state and land in a different state, and lands, and then cases which involve a state or its citizen in a foreign country. Those are obvious situations where the state courts, the state Supreme Court, would not have jurisdiction. Now, notice a couple of things. Constitution gives no authority to the Supreme Court to rule over cases involving citizens of the same state. So if two people in Louisiana sue one another, it goes up the state, it goes up the system, and the Supreme Court of Louisiana rules on that case. That's it. That should be it constitutionally. They can't appeal that to the Supreme Court because it involves citizens of the same state, and in that case, the state Supreme Court is supreme. It has final jurisdiction. That has been trampled on. Nobody thinks that way at all anymore. And there's a reason I'll get to in a moment. But further, here's the interesting thing. The Supreme Court is not made the sole judge of constitutionality or the sole interpreter of the Constitution. The states themselves are parties to the federal compact, and they also have equal rights to judge the legitimacy of the laws and the acts of the federal government. That was the position, remember, of the Kentucky resolutions and the Virginia resolutions in 1798, written by Thomas Jefferson. He insisted that the states had the right to judge whether or not a federal action was constitutional. It wasn't just the Supreme Court that gave their opinion. The parties to the compact have a right to go through it. Alexander Hamilton makes this plain. He says the principles established in a former paper, he's talking about Federalist number 32, teach us that the states will retain all pre-existing authorities which may not be exclusively delegated to the federal head. Though these principles may not apply with the same force to the judiciary as to the legislative power, yet I'm inclined to think that they are in the main just with respect to the former as well as the latter. And under this impression, I shall lay it down as a rule that the state courts will retain the jurisdiction they now have unless it appears to be taken away in one of the enumerated modes, that is, if it's one of the delegated powers of the federal government. But the states have the right to judge this thing, this constitutionality. Richard Speight, who was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention from North Carolina, in the ratification debates in North Carolina, he assured his fellow citizens that the federal courts under the Constitution would not have jurisdiction over state concerns, nor would they attempt, he said, to apply the Constitution to state and local or personal activities beyond its scope. These men never envisioned the intervention of the federal courts or the Supreme Court into the matters of a state, into the concerns of a state or the disputes that are going on within a state. They would not have that authority. The Judiciary Act is what changed things. In 1789, it gave the Supreme Court authority to receive writs of error from the states, which opened the door then to overturn and reverse decisions of state courts if one of the losing lawyer felt like the state Supreme Court had made an error. So that's what changed things. That act, however, was never exercised take over, to extend the powers of the Supreme Court until John Marshall was the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But even after this, it was the assumption on the part of the states that the Supreme Court or any of the federal courts, if they rendered judgments on matters not authorized by the Constitution, the states were not bound to submit to those judgments. And that's what we have to remember today. Chauncey Burr, who was one of the leading legal scholars in the 19th century, he wrote this in 1868. He said, "The Supreme Court has jurisdiction over no matter which the states have not delegated in the Constitution, over all matters which the states have not delegated to the federal government. The state courts are supreme." So you see, the Supreme Court never was envisioned to be this domineering, final judge of all matters constitutional, or of everything that happened in a state court, or of a law passed by a state legislature. The states had the right to pass any laws that they felt were appropriate for the citizens of their states. The Supreme Court had no right to come in unless they passed a law that infringed upon the things forbidden to states or infringed upon the powers that they had delegated to the federal government. The Supreme Court had no other power if it didn't. And so most of the things that are done by the Supreme Court is unconstitutional today. Okay, well, paragraph 2 talks about original and appellate jurisdiction, and note again that this is expressly spelled out. But notice the phrase in paragraph 2, "The Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction both as to law and to fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make." In other words, the Congress has the right to limit the authority, the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court however it pleases. So it is still possible for Congress, if we ever had a Congress that was willing to think about this, it's still possible for the Congress to come back and say, you have no authority, you have no jurisdiction to meddle with the laws of any individual states unless it's clearly a usurpation of the state. They could do that and undo the Judicial Act of 1798. So that's, you see, again, there's so many, even with the things that you would want to change in the Constitution, there are still so many safeguards that you could utilize that haven't been changed. They're still there, and they could be constitutionally utilized if we had men who were willing to exercise those things. Well, the next section 3 deals with treason, the definition of it and the punishment of it, and then Article 4 talks about the states, mutual good faith and all of that stuff. Article 5 talks about the amendment process. Amendments can be proposed by the states by the approval of 2/3, or proposed to the states by the approval of 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and they become part of the Constitution if 3/4 of the states ratify them. Then you have in Article 6 some general provisions. Some of these are very, very interesting. Paragraph 2 is the phrase that's often quoted when people want to try to uphold federal authority against the states. But they quote this because it says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. What is meant, that people take that to mean that the federal government has unlimited authority because the Constitution grants them that, but it's not the case. This doesn't do that at all. And Alexander Hamilton made that plain. He said it will not follow, he's talking about this phrase, it will not follow from this phrase that acts of the larger society, that's the federal government, which are not pursuant to its constitutional powers, but which are invasions of the residuary authorities of the smaller societies, that's the states, will become the supreme law of the land. These will merely be acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. It will not, I presume, have escaped observation that it expressly confines this supremacy to laws made pursuant to the Constitution. So he's saying this phrase only refers to those powers given to the federal government by the Constitution, those express powers, delegated powers. Anything else is not, it's a usurpation, and it should be treated as a usurpation. That is, it should be ignored. Paragraph 3 talks about, this is another controversial thing because of the way it's been used, that an oath is required for office holding, but no religious test is required to hold office. Now, some Christians, as well as many, many atheists, of course, have said this is evidence the Founding Fathers were not concerned to defend Christianity, and it was intended to allow for atheists and unbelievers to take leadership positions in the country. And that is patently false. Though there were those present who believed that this phrase could be used and interpreted in such a way that would allow atheists and pagans to take office, the majority read it as a prohibition against allowing one denomination, one Christian denomination, to take precedence over another Christian denomination. Remember, the term religion in the 18th century was a term used to describe Christianity. That was the true religion. Everything else was an idolatry or a paganism or something like that. So they intended by this provision to prevent requiring an office holder to be a Presbyterian or to be an Anglican or to be a Methodist or to be Baptist. They have to be Christians because every state required office holders to be Christians, but they didn't have to be a member of a particular denomination. This was important, especially to the Episcopalians after the Anglicans after the War for Independence. They were concerned that the Presbyterians were going to make it impossible for them to hold office since they were members of the Church of England. And they didn't want to be excluded from office, as you can imagine. So the man that made this motion, he actually wanted this in the Constitution, was Charles Pinckney. He was from South Carolina, a devout Episcopalian. This was seconded by the men that you see on the board there, by Gouverneur Morris and Charles Pinckney's cousin, General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, again, both devout Episcopalians. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney was elected unanimously as the president of the Charleston Bible Society, and for 15 years he served there prior to his death. The farthest thing from the minds of these men was banning Christianity from the government or allowing, opening up political offices to pagans and atheists. They were concerned to protect the place of Episcopalians in the government. They didn't want the Presbyterians shutting out the Episcopalians. And so they didn't want a state church, in other words. Edmund Randolph actually says this. He commented on this provision in the ratification debates in Virginia. He says, although officers and so on are to swear that they will support this Constitution, yet they are not bound to support one mode of worship or to adhere to one particular sect. And remember, the word sect here means denomination, Christian denomination. It puts all sects on the same footing. In other words, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Episcopalians, and so forth, nobody's going to be discriminated against when it comes to holding office in the country. No matter what church you belong to, you can, if you get lawfully elected, you can hold office. So North Carolina's James Iredell made the same point. He said the people of this country, they don't want, obviously they didn't want an Anglican establishment. They didn't want an established church at all. But neither did they wish to see the United States as anything less than an openly Christian nation. Indeed, he said, a Protestant Christian nation. They did not expect to allow Roman Catholics into the highest offices, but in particular, they feared the influx of pagans, unbelievers, deists, and Mohammedans. He said, that's what we are afraid of. We don't want them to have the right to hold office. So it was Oliver Wolcott of Connecticut said, the very fact that we are requiring an oath means that that's actually a religious test. He said, that means you have to believe in God to take an oath. Look at what he says here. He says, the officers of the United States made such things as religious test oaths an unnecessary redundancy because of the nature of oaths. An oath, Wolcott said, is a direct appeal that God, who is the avenger of perjury, will judge you. Such an appeal to him is a full acknowledgement of his being and providence. He said, if you take an oath, you just passed a religious test. You believe, obviously, in a God who can judge liars. The same thing was said by James Iredell. And let's see if I can get that slide up there. James Iredell The oath, he said, is a solemn appeal to a supreme being for the truth of what is said by a person who believes in the existence of a supreme being. So, to James Iredale's mind, the oath itself was a test, since it establishes the fact that political authority does not flow from the people, but from him who hath made us as we are, the great sovereign to whom we shall all owe an accounting at the last day. So these men had a great fear of an established church, that is, making one a national church, making one denomination the only official denomination, but they had no fear of this country becoming a pagan nation. They never thought it would ever become a non-Christian nation where unbelievers could hold office and brag about their unbelief or enforce some laws based upon paganism. So in such an environment, you see, they weren't afraid of apostasy. They were concerned about persecution. Well, they were, again, that's part of the problem that shows that some of the naivete. They didn't believe in how sinister sin really is and how deep sin affects men. Well, Article 7 talks about the ratification of the Constitution, and so let me just skip to the interpretation of the Constitution in the last few minutes. How should the Constitution be interpreted? Well, we should interpret it just like we interpret any other historical document. When you read the Bible, I want to know what the Greek and Hebrew say so that I can understand what was originally intended by God, and then I can tell you how it applies to you. But I have to know that original intent to understand the text. And in the same way, you interpret historical documents by understanding the original intent of the authors. Chauncey Burr makes that statement. He says it is the rule laid down by Blackstone, that's William Blackstone, the English commentator on law. He said that the intention of the parties to a compact is the key to its meaning. The terms and language must be referred to the time of its enactment and must be taken as understood by those who so employed them, and not according to any subsequent definition. Thus, the Constitution of the United States must be explained as those who made and framed it intended. Their intention is the law. Now, you see, you have to do that because words change their meaning. It's just like the word religion. The meaning of that has changed. We don't use it the same way unless, I remember, and some of you would remember when we were growing up, you would hear often people say, you need to get some religion. And they weren't talking about go under New Age meditation technique. They were talking about believing in Jesus and being converted is what they were talking about. They use religion in that way. Well, we don't use the term religion in that way anymore, and you will misread the Constitution if that's the way you read it, if that's the way you import a modern meaning into the older word. Chauncey Burr is just saying you have to take words and terms in the way that they were meant at the time they were written. That's the intention of the men who used them. When this rule is cast aside, the liberties which the Constitution was intended to preserve will be lost. Again, listen to Chauncey Burr again. He says, such were the rules by the Constitution, by which the Constitution was interpreted by the Supreme Court, undeviatingly from the foundation of the government to 1863. Since this last date, a change has come over the spirit of the judiciary, which is in violation of all the past rules of interpretation, and indeed of judicial proceedings among all enlightened nations. The doctrine has been boldly proclaimed by leading journals that laws and compacts are to be construed so as to be in harmony with the will of the people, and judges have, in too many instances, succumbed to this monstrous delusion. If indeed it amounts to overthrow of all fixed and regular governments and leaves the passions and fancies of an hour the only guarantees of liberty. Exactly right. Because of this view of constitutional interpretation, we become a nation of men ruled by the opinions and whims of the Supreme Court justices and other politicians, rather than a nation of laws. It's turned everything on its head, and it's been happening for a long time. He said 1863. What was happening in 1863? Well, and so there's a revolution that's been going on ever since that time. The Constitution has not been rejected, it's not been discarded, it's been reinterpreted so that the original intent and obvious meaning can be ignored. This man is the man who was the Associate Attorney General or Deputy Attorney General during the Nixon administration, supposedly a conservative administration, Donald Santarelli. Look at what he says about the Constitution and how to interpret it. He says, the Constitution is flexible. Your point of view depends on whether you are winning. The Constitution isn't the real issue in this. It is how you want to run the country and achieve national goals. The language of the Constitution is not at issue. It is what you can interpret it to mean in light of modern needs. In talking about a constitutional crisis, we are not grappling with the real needs of running the country, but are using the issues for the self-serving purpose of striking a new balance of power. Today, the whole Constitution is up for grabs. It is exactly right. That's the way the Constitution is used in our country. It means what you want it to mean to further your agenda. The issues facing us is not one of political reform only, and that's what we need to realize. It's important that we understand the Constitution. It's important that you know these details so that you can actually teach your children, teach others, encourage others to stand up when things are unconstitutional. But you see that even the best Constitution is only as good as the men who are ruling. What we're facing here is a crisis of character. We've lost character, and that's come about because of the loss of biblical faith. Dr. Rushdoony again made this point. He says the Constitution still stands, basically the same document, despite certain amendments, and its character has changed little in the past 50 years. Now, he's writing this in 1960-something. The interpretation thereof has changed, reflecting a now deeply rooted revolution is in American faith and life. The outcome of the struggle between the older faith and the newer approach will certainly be reflected at the polls and in the courts, but it will be settled first of all in the religious decisions of men. Inescapably, history is the outworking of religious commitments. Exactly right. It's amazing when you go through the Constitution and you see that it has not been changed that much. There have been some significant changes, but really, on the whole, it stands pretty much in its same form. It's not been amended at critical points. It's simply being ignored, and this again points back to the true source of our problems. We are being ruled by immoral men. A.H. Stevens, who was the vice president of the Confederate States of America, he made this statement. He said, our security is not in a constitution, but in a godly society. Ungodly men will ignore and trample upon the best of constitutions, and that's exactly what we have seen happen over the last 150 to 200 years. And as a consequence, the Founding Fathers would not recognize this country. They would be aghast at what we are living in today. They would never have imagined that this country could be transformed as it has. We've become a nation that lives by whim, ignores the law, and doesn't apologize for it, is not even ashamed or embarrassed in the least. We certainly ought to know and understand our Constitution. We certainly need to insist that it be followed, but we have to realize that nothing will be accomplished toward the restoration of the nation until we once again have men who love the truth, who are willing to be faithful and do what is right, regardless of the consequences. So you can't have reform, as you know, without the Great Commission. That's the key. We can study the Constitution, and we should, but that's not going to solve our problems. Let me stop. Do you have any questions or comments about things? Yeah. She's always doing that.
So back when all the election was going on, you had I think it was Pennsylvania and Arizona. They were being encouraged by Giuliani to the legislature to call you have the power to select delegates, not the governor. So you can pull those. You have the constitutional power, legislative power to pull those back. Those weren't even allowed to go before the Supreme Court as a constitutional matter.
Right.
They just get locked up in the circuit in the federal courts. And so the Supreme Court
Right.
Even if it is strictly a constitutional issue.
Right. In other words, if it doesn't come, if it's not appealed from a federal court, they are not going to hear it. And even if you appeal, I think there is a way to make an appeal directly, but they get to choose what they're going to hear or not. And if they don't want to hear it, it doesn't matter how significant you might think it is. If they don't grant a hearing, it's done. They don't hear every case that's right.
And it wasn't that they didn't say that they didn't think there was anything wrong with it, they just chose not to admit it.
Right.
How is that?
Well, if you had, see, here's the thing, they have to have that authority because otherwise they'd have 400 cases before them every day. They can't, you can't be obligated to hear every case. You have to make a judgment on what is significant, what isn't. The problem again is not so much that allowance, but how it's exercised and why. And so the men who are making those decisions, they can say, well, that's probably a strong case, but it attacks something I'm in favor of, and I wouldn't want that to be heard, so it's going to be pushed aside. That's a possibility, not saying that they do that all the time, but I mean, it's pretty clear that some things that are pretty important don't get heard. They don't get a hearing at all before the Supreme Court. So we can't take away the authority to not hear. You can't be obligated to try every case before you or hear every case. But there again, the issue is the character of the men, not so much the rules that are there. Yeah. The men that wrote the Constitution, just about all of them were. Just about all of them. There's some question about a couple of them, but all of them were members of churches. Most of them were, and all of them were members in good standing. They'd been baptized like you, and they would go to church. So they were, we would say, yeah, they profess to be Christians, and that's the way we view them. Yeah, Walt.
Steve, these men recognize the evil in me, but seem to be naive in not understanding that what they build could not be mortality. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, there's no question about it. And you can see why. I mean, when you're living in a country, imagine, I don't know, it stretches the bounds of our possible imaginations, I know, but imagine you lived in a country where 99% of the people were baptized Christians who actually went to worship every Sunday. And you could talk to them, and they would be thinking, generally, biblically, we wouldn't agree on every point, but you could actually argue something with them, and they'd be able to follow it and be willing to listen to you. And they'd come back with another argument, and you could actually have a discussion. But there's never any question in your mind that these people are honest people. I've dealt with them in many other areas. They've been very fine. We disagree at this point, but my goodness, that's a good man, and I've known his family for how long, and I knew his daddy. And when you live in a society like that, you don't feel compelled to put all kind of safeguards up because it's almost like an insult to your neighbor at that point, because it makes you look like you don't trust anybody when you do. And it's easy when everybody kind of agrees, and the people who don't agree don't say anything out loud. Nobody knew. Imagine this: nobody knew Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. Nobody knew. That's why he got elected president. He would never have been elected if they had seen some of the things he had been writing privately. He would never have been elected in this country, and he knew he would not be elected in the country, so he never said anything publicly. And every action he took as if he was a Christian. I mean, you read the things he wrote. He didn't come out and say, well, I'm not a Christian, but I want us to be nice to those people. He acted and spoke as one of them. Of course, what happened was he apostatized. He was a member of a Presbyterian church in Virginia and was on the pulpit committee at one point in that church. But things changed. But the point is that even the people that were not believers, Benjamin Franklin perhaps being preeminent, talked like believers, lived generally, except in very private ways that they wouldn't have ever wanted to come out. They lived openly, publicly, at least honorable lives, and were concerned about doing things right and all that. In that kind of situation, you just kind of assume, this country, there's no question about what our commitments are. Our commitments are to being faithful to God, following His Word, doing the Ten Commandments. That's the way we are. That's who we are. And you just don't realize that things can change over time like they've changed. And that's why I say I don't think they would even recognize what country this is. Listening to the president now or to any of the Congress, they would just go, where are these people? How could they possibly have been elected to these positions? How could you allow these people to stand up in public and say those things? They'd be run out on a rail in any other genuine civilization. So it was naive. They didn't take total depravity seriously, though they all believed it. But they just didn't take it as seriously as they could have. And it's like the language that Christians use. Like George Washington always spoke like a deist, the providence, the hand of providence, and he never talked very biblically about things. And some said, well, he didn't believe it. Well, maybe he didn't, but that was a common language of the day. Providence was another way of saying the triune God. And they just didn't think about being precise in their language. In part, we're so precise because we know how men fiddle with language now, and what they say matters, how they describe God. If they don't pray in Jesus' name, we get a little concerned about it because they're compromising in our minds. But that would not have entered their minds at all. You're living in this general Christian culture, and people use that generalized language that everybody uses, and it's polite, and they don't think anything of it. We would, but they don't. They didn't. But it's a different culture, different situation. We really can't put ourselves back in that time frame. Is there anything else? Well, thank you for coming. I hope this has been helpful, and I hope that we can continue with some things some other time. But anyway, I appreciate you coming, and it's been fun to go through this. Let me close us in prayer. Father, thank you again that your hand you are working still, and even though we don't always see exactly what you're doing, we give you thanks that you have assured us that you continue to work your purposes in the earth, working even evil out to good, for the good ends that you've ordained. We thank you for that and the assurance that you've given us that you will work everything together for our good and your glory. We pray for our country, that you will take out of offices all the men that are ungodly, who only care about their own selfish advancement and don't care about the well-being of our people, of this nation. And we pray you'll give us righteous and wise and godly leadership in the church and in the state, so that we can see your kingdom advancing, and that we as a country might not be a hindrance to the advancement of the kingdom of Jesus, our Savior, in whose name we pray. Amen.